everybody to, I believe it's the third official session in our speaker session, Environmental Justice in North Carolina. Today we will be hearing from Darien Herndon. She is a Duke senior, class of 2021, is a member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina and an affiliate of the Tuscarora Indian Nation. She's a 2020 Udall Scholar, woo, thumbs up to that. And she is president of Duke's Native American Student Association and a founding chapter member of Alpha Pi Omega sorority, the country's oldest Native American sorority. So before we get started here, I just want to do a few housekeeping items. If everyone could please make sure that they're muted. It looks like everybody is, but just wanted to make sure that that was the case. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, name, Duke affiliation. We just kind of want to get a sense for who is here and who is participating in our webinar series this year. And after the talk today, after we hear from Darien, we will have time for Q&A. So please feel free to put any questions that you have throughout the session in the chat, and we will get to them at the end. So I think without further ado, let's hear from the amazing Darien. Yes, snaps. Yeah, super excited.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is having an amazing evening so far. Today's topic, I will be talking about Indigenous peoples and environmental justice. And with that, I will begin sharing my screen. And can everyone see that? Okay, perfect. So like I said, today's topic will be on Indigenous peoples and environmental justice, particularly within North Carolina. So I'll start with a traditional introduction, and you all have had a brief introduction about me already, but Hi, my name is Darien, and I'm a member of the Lumbee Tribe, also affiliated with the Tuscarora Nation. I am from Lumberton, North Carolina, and as Cameron said, I am a senior here at Duke, and I'm majoring in biology with a double minor in chemistry and history. So before we start, I would like to give a land acknowledgement. So a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory that you reside on, and it is a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Therefore, I would like to acknowledge that Duke University gathers on land that has long served as the site of meeting and exchange among a number of Indigenous peoples, historically the Shakori and Ina. It is also important to recognize the 8 tribes that currently reside in North Carolina. These include the Coharie, the Lumbee, the Mahiran, the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi, the Havawa Saponi, the Waccamaw Siouan, the Saponi, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee. We honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which we gather. So the first thing I'll go into is what are environmental injustices. By definition, environmental injustice can be defined as the disproportionate exposure of communities of color and poor to pollution, and its contaminant effects on health and the environment, as well as the unequal environmental protection and environmental quality provided through laws, regulations, governmental programs, enforcement, and policies. Some examples of environmental injustices that have been in the media recently are the Flint, Michigan water crisis, the burning of indigenous land in South America, the Dakota access pipeline, and just well-known high cancer rates among minority populations across the country and world due to contaminated land and water. So unsustainable human practices are continuously altering the earth, and this alteration has contributed to a phenomenon called climate change. Climate change impacts all life on Earth, from the atmosphere to oceans and plants and animals. Many species are already extinct, and parts of the Earth are experiencing drastic weather changes, with these events becoming exponentially more common. With increases of surface temperature, occurrences of extreme and unpredictable weather events, pollution in the air and water, and destabilization of natural systems, humans are now beginning to feel the effects of climate change as well. Minority populations and populations living in poverty are feeling this impact of climate change more than anyone else. Indigenous people and their homelands are particularly vulnerable to climate change, and ironically, these people have historically put forth more effort to protect the environment, and still capitalistic behaviors are contributing to their oppression. And while climate change is a focal point in today's media, Indigenous peoples are often excluded from this narrative and are only mentioned in rare and extreme cases. And this is just a quote that I like to show people when talking about this topic. And it talks about how Indigenous peoples, although they make up only 5% of the world's population, they protect 30% of the world's biodiversity. So Indigenous people themselves are at high risk of facing environmental issues, and that's for various reasons. So Native communities have deep ties to the land in which they've lived on for thousands of years. These lands define their histories, their cultures, and their way of life. However, environmental problems caused by unsustainable practices are continually impacting Indigenous peoples at the expense of their land culture and health. Due to surface and groundwater contamination, illegal dumping of hazardous waste disposal, air pollution, mining waste, habitat destruction, and climate change, many Indigenous peoples face an array of health and welfare risks. Despite land trust and treaties, corporations still find ways to seize native lands for these projects. These projects damage important cultural sites, contaminate the water and soil, and oftentimes force Native communities to have to relocate. Unfortunately, many of these projects disproportionately impact these Native communities, and they disregard Native voices. Corporations and the government strategically target Native communities because of the unique situation concerning land ownership. Therefore, Native communities are at higher risk of being impacted by environmental issues. For example, less than 2% of North Carolina's population identify as Native American, yet 13% of the people living within 1 mile of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline are Native. And this percentage exponentially increases if that 1 mile distance is extended. Unfortunately, Native peoples face violence as a result of protecting their lands and water. Natives were historically removed from their lands, and this is still happening today, as natives are forced from their lands under threat of arrest for protecting the lands that they are currently on. Despite Indigenous peoples protecting and sustaining the earth for thousands of years, they are continually punished for fighting environmental justice, even in the face of global environmental crises. Although Indigenous peoples are impacted by climate change more than any group, their voices are rarely heard. They are a constant target of corporations and governments with the capitalistic views, and in most cases, these companies are altering the land for projects near tribal lands, and these tribes are often not consulted, and in the cases in which they are not properly informed of the risks. Therefore, the cycle of poverty and destruction within tribal communities continues. Despite events like this happening frequently and across the globe, most of the world is unaware of these issues, and that stems from a lack of media coverage. So talking about issues that are specific to the Appalachia region, many of these existing issues include coal mining, issues that are related to agriculture, so runoff from whether it be fertilizer or livestock waste. And then you have the issue of urbanization, which causes deforestation and other issues, the buildings of pipelines, which can ultimately lead to oil spills and contaminate the surrounding land and water, and then air pollution, which can come from various sources. As an impact, we see various environmental damages, a multitude of health issues, whether it be chronic or acute, and we also see water and air quality reductions. So environmental issues impacting Native American communities here in North Carolina. So just as Indigenous peoples elsewhere, Native Americans in North Carolina are disproportionately impacted by environmental issues, and these issues expand from agricultural pollution to pipelines. So most Native American communities here in North Carolina are centrally located in the rural areas of the state. This puts the communities at risk for various environmental issues, and given the booming agricultural economy of the state, farming contaminates the local waterways and land as livestock waste and fertilizer chemicals are disposed off carelessly. And because agriculture is such a big part of the economy, these environmental harmful activities are often overlooked by the state government. However, one of the biggest environmental worries recently has been the construction of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. But before we get into talking about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, I would like to talk about some of the water pollution in Indigenous communities in Robeson County specifically. And this data comes from the website listed in the right corner. And just a reminder that just because a legal amount of a certain chemical is listed, that does not mean it is safe. So if you look at this chart, you can see that these various contaminants that are in the Robeson County water system are multiple times higher than what the health guideline states. And all of these contaminants specifically have the potential to cause cancer. And if you all don't know, Native Americans have some of the highest cancer rates out of any other minority population. And if you're interested at looking at the water systems in your own area, this link will be attached in a follow-up email after this presentation. So going into the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, pipelines going through Indigenous lands without consent is not a new occurrence, and the biggest case to pick up media attention was the Dakota Access Pipeline. And despite the public outcry and eventual pipeline spills from the Dakota Access Pipeline, history continues to repeat itself. And this time it is on the other side of the country, and it spans from West Virginia through Virginia and ends in Robeson County, North Carolina. This proposed pipeline was intended to go from West Virginia and to transport natural gas into North Carolina, where the pipeline would end at an energy plant located in Robeson County, which is my hometown. And the proposed route of the pipeline goes through several Native American communities in North Carolina, disproportionately putting them at risk. And if you look at the photo that is attached to this slide, on the bottom, you can see the various Native American communities highlighted here in North Carolina. These show the 8 tribes as well as some urban clusters of Native people. And then if you look above, you can see the proposed pipeline route and how it goes through several of these tribal communities, and most of them to be exact. So the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is funded by Dominion Energy, Duke Energy, Piedmont Natural Gas, and Southern Company Gas, with Dominion and Duke serving as the lead stakeholders. And these companies had already begun building despite some denied permits because of existing environmental risks. And there were also a couple cases that were found where some reports had been falsified, stating that tribes were consulted when there was not an official consultation to have ever occurred. So this pipeline was continuing to progress as they hide behind the face of innovation, when in reality they are destroying local communities. And this is not isolated to Native communities, as other minority communities are greatly impacted by this proposed pipeline. So North Carolina actually has the largest Native American population east of the Mississippi River, and is also home to the 9th largest tribe in the nation, which is the Lumbee Tribe. The Lumbee people, meaning people of the dark water, are centrally located in Robeson County, and they are dependent on the land for economic, cultural, and sustainable practices. This construction of the pipeline puts the tribe's well-being at risk, as it will run straight through the community. And although, and like I said, going back, although Native Americans only make up 1% of the state population, 13% of people are living within 1 mile of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And unlike Standing Rock, this event has received almost no media coverage, which makes it easier for pipeline builders to take advantage of Native communities. And additionally, a lack of federal recognition for the tribes in North Carolina makes it a lot harder to protect their lands, and it makes it easier for companies to take advantage of that. However, these tribes in North Carolina have been fighting against the Atlantic Coast Pipeline since its proposal, as well as other allies within the state and outside of the state. And recently, it was determined that pipeline construction would be canceled. However, this was not due to the concern for health and the Native communities. It was a concern for cost. So now I will show a video that talks a little bit about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the implications. For my people, healing is a connection between the mind and the body. Therefore, our connection with the earth is sacred. North Carolina hosts one of the largest Native populations east of the Mississippi River. There are 8 state-recognized tribes, and Robeson County, which is located in southeastern North Carolina, is home to the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River, the Lumbee Tribe. The Lumbee people have already experienced the effects of climate change, with 2 major hurricanes devastating their communities within the last 3 years. Even before the disasters, Robeson County had one of the highest poverty rates, not only in the state, but in the country. Despite the hardships that natives face already, the proposed pipeline goes through several Native communities, disproportionately impacting these communities, putting them at risk.
It was an environmental disaster that drove thousands of people from their homes.
Methane gas into the air, leaving 50 million pounds of methane.
Breathing problems, respiratory problems.
People caused the explosion and then fueled the spectacular. Continue to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result.
In Native American culture, our land constitutes as part of our identity. It gave us our culture, our tradition. It helped us develop our way of life. For the next 7 generations, I want you to think about the environmental effects that this will have on our children, our grandchildren, and their children. But many people still fish upon these waterways. A lot of people use them for recreational uses, including myself. These are cultural resources that are being threatened. And not just the cultural resources, but our native identity. But Duke and Dominion don't seem to care about these things, which is completely evident by the lack of consultation that they gave it to the various tribes in North Carolina. It's a shame. It's a shame that there are tribes that weren't even informed that this would be going to their lands.
My people come from the land. My people come from the land. My people come from the land. On which you stand, defying the white man, defying the white man. Back to forever, barrel. My people living in peril with
So yeah, that was a clip that kind of shows the protest, and the aerial view in which you saw was actually an aerial view of the building of the pipeline while it was still in construction. Um, so that is pretty much all I have as far as ways that people can help. The biggest thing is to try and educate yourself on the environmental topics that impact both Native communities and other minority communities. And then once having those resources, signing petitions, uplifting minority voices, because these are the people that are the most impacted by these issues. And there are just various organizations that you can utilize to either donate or just learn more and help spread information. So if anyone has any other questions after this presentation, this is my email, and then the information for the Duke Native American Student Alliance is below, and that is our Facebook and our Instagram. And if you have any questions in regards to this presentation or just learning more about the Native American community at Duke, you can reach out to those two pages. And with that, we can go into the Q&A.
Let's just give a quick silent round of applause or snaps, whatever you're comfortable doing. I know y'all are on mute for Darien. That was awesome. So getting into questions, thank you to those who have put questions in there. The first one I wanted to address was by one of our House Corps students, Zoe, just because it's a question that I had actually had as well. And you touched on it a little bit, I think, in your presentation. What difference do tribes make, if any, on enabling Native peoples to protect their land? And kind of in a similar vein, those that are federally recognized versus not federally recognized, how does that, I guess, influence the impact they're able to have or the way that they're treated in these conversations?
Yeah, so just a disclaimer, I come from a non-federally recognized tribe, so I can't completely speak about how things work for federally recognized tribes or just other tribes in general, because it varies from tribe to tribe. But most federal recognized tribes, they have reservations and their land is in a land trust. Therefore, they have less ownership rights of the land, and the government has more advantage as far as doing what they want with the land and having a little bit of control over that. And then the difference between that and between state and federal recognition. So, and even tribes that are not recognized by the state, because those tribes do exist as well. For those people, we do not have treaties with the government. We do not have federal land in trust. Therefore, the tribe doesn't necessarily have ownership of the land in which this is impacting. So for state recognized tribal communities, it's a lot harder for the tribe to step in and say, we do not want this coming through our community, just because they do not have like full ownership of the land.
And one person, Claudia, asked, following up on that above question, what does partial recognition mean in that context? Is that referring to state versus federal recognition, or if you could provide clarity on that?
So there's different types of partial recognition. So there's state recognition and federal recognition. So for state recognized tribes, they do not experience the same benefits as federally recognized tribes as far as the relationship with the government. So state recognized tribes do not have access to reservations, land trust, and they miss out on a lot of funding to help better the community, whether it be through education, housing funding, and healthcare funding, so IHS facilities, which is Indian Health Services. But for the Lumbee Tribe, we are in a very unique predicament where we have federal recognition, so we are federally recognized by the tribe, but we do not have full federal recognition, which means that we are unable to receive the benefits that a fully federally recognized tribe would.
Thank you for clarifying that. And so another question from Zoe, you mentioned in your presentation that governments often take advantage of Indigenous lands their unique ownership model. Could you expand a bit on what this model looks like?
So like I said, tribes ultimately, for federally recognized tribes, there's often land that is in trust, which is considered a reservation. And the government is able to kind of like take advantage of this because like in the case of the Dakota Access Pipeline, although that was on their sacred land, the government pretty much overrode that and said, we need this pipeline to come through here. So they completely disregarded the tribe's wishes and the fact that that was culturally sacred land. So that just kind of shows you how the government can and will take advantage of native land.
And just a quick question about the video, the video that you showed. Margaret, just wanted to know a bit more about the film. I guess how it came about. You created it, so maybe some context there.
So yeah, that was a film that I created for a class on environmental, it was called Ecomedia. So it talked about how the environmental issues are incorporated into media. So the whole film talks more about a general stance of Indigenous people and environmental justice across the United States. But it focuses on the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And some of the film material is from me directly as far as protests that I attended, and information that I gathered, as well as speakers that I had specifically talk for that video. But the other footage is from like, there's a lot of Standing Rock footage that I obtained from one of my mentors who was there. And there's also footage from community members who gave it to me for this presentation. And also the link to that video will also be in the follow-up email for people who want to watch the entire thing.
Yes, we're going to be providing those links. And thank you for sharing that video. I know I was also in that Ecomedia class and never got to see it, which was disappointing. So that was nice. Kind of going along this media vein, so you talked about how media coverage of these incidents or sort of pipelines going through Indigenous lands and Indigenous communities has not been covered to the extent that it should be, which perhaps that's something you could say to environmental justice coverage all over the country. The media coverage has been horrible. But as it seems that news outlets are taking this turn, this shift, especially as the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests have really made apparent the I guess the discrimination and the disparity between BIPOC communities and I guess news outlets and what they're covering. Do you have any hope for how media may shift their angles or may start to cover these issues a bit more? Any thoughts on that?
So yeah, so the video, and there's a supplementary essay that talks about how media itself can play a role in how environmental issues are addressed, especially among Native communities. For Native communities in particular, a lot of people are uneducated about the Native communities and oftentimes do not realize that we are still living and existing people. And even so, they don't make the connection between modern issues and like just Indigenous communities. So if you look at the Dakota Access Pipeline versus the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, despite people like living in the same state in which this is occurring, many people did not know about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and most of them were completely unaware of how it disproportionately impacted the Native communities here in North Carolina. Whereas a lot of people did hear about the Dakota Access Pipeline, and we ultimately saw that with the media coverage and a lot of the media going viral on social media of the Dakota Access Pipeline. We saw a lot of people coming in supporting the tribes, whether it be physically on social media through donations, and we saw a huge outcry from the general public here in the United States. And I think that was really beneficial in raising awareness for the issue. Ultimately, it didn't cancel it until recently, and there was a pipeline spill, which is very unfortunate. But without that media attention, I feel like the situation could have been a lot worse as far as the violence that the indigenous people who were protecting the land faced. There were videos of police attacking them despite them being within their legal rights to protest. And I feel like that's something that without media, people would not have known about and would have probably been worse for those people. But yet we see that most people did not know about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. And because of that, I feel like it was a lot harder for the Native communities here to fight against it. And it's just very obvious that social media and just media in general are making the fight for social justice a lot easier for those who are already at a disadvantage, and it sheds light on a lot of issues that would have not been in light had these people not been advocating to push for it and to push to get it in media.
And I just want to kind of, I guess you could consider this a follow-up to, I guess, the idea of media and social media expanding upon the voices that people have in these situations, all people, BIPOC communities, individuals of all colors, creeds, and identities. Can you describe, or do you have any thoughts on how the fight and the feelings regarding disputes over land and legal right to build things like natural gas pipelines for indigenous communities may intersect, I suppose, with the fight that low-income communities, Black and Brown communities are also facing with these with the similar issues. They're impacting. I'm just curious how, as we dive into issues that also impact Black communities, Latinx communities, et cetera, where the differences may come in between how indigenous communities are dealing with developers, or where the collaboration comes in.
Yeah, I think there's a huge intersection between just minority groups and low-income communities, just because these are the two communities that are most at risk for environmental issues and other social justice issues. Historically, these are the groups that have been targeted by the government and just people in power, because in the past it has been thought that these are the groups that can be taken advantage of the easiest. And so you see a lot of intersection between minority groups fighting for the same causes, whether it be environmental issues. And like I said, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline not only impacted Native American communities, but most of the communities that it went through were low-income minority communities, and that included Black and Latinx communities. So yeah, I think there's a lot of intersectionality, and even going through the social justice protests that are occurring now, there's a lot of support from indigenous communities for Black Lives Matter, and that's ultimately because we are trying to push for the same changes, because there are natives who go through police brutality and all of the same issues. So I think in order to solve these issues, it's uplifting the voices of those who are most impacted and just supporting each other. And I've seen a lot of that support, especially recently.
So diving a bit into the Atlantic Coast Pipeline specifically, we know that it was canceled over the summer. This is a question from Angela. Could you expand on what advocacy groups are looking to do next? For example, are communities still fighting for compensation for any environmental damages from construction that had already occurred?
So although the pipeline has been canceled, there's a power facility that is where the pipeline was supposed to end that is still being built. I know these groups are still fighting against that, and I have a strong feeling that it will also be canceled very soon. And I'm not sure if communities are fighting for compensation yet. I think we are still looking at, well, not looking at, but still kind of celebrating the cancellation of the pipeline. But I'm almost certain that various environmental groups and just people who are allies that were against the pipeline are working together to possibly come up with some form of compensation for parts of the pipeline that were already built. But I'm not sure what that would look like.
And I'll just say that I think this isn't Indigenous specific, but I know that there are some articles in like in NC Policy Watch and stuff that touch upon how the pipeline has impacted people, like how the construction and the piling of dirt and all this like built all the development ended up messing up people's property values and stuff. So that's just a potential resource for anyone looking to learn more about the pipeline specifically. I want to go back a little bit. We have a question from Leah who's asking about federal and state recognition. How does a tribe become federally recognized? Do you have any insight into the obstacles in the way of gaining recognition? And is that something different North Carolina tribes are currently striving for?
Yeah. So there are two routes of federal recognition that tribes can take to get federal recognition. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but there are two, and they go through different branches of the government. One of them is a more common route, whereas the other one is not as common, and the uncommon one is actually the one that the Lumbee Tribe is going through at the moment. And there are a lot of obstacles in the way of gaining recognition because there are specific requirements that kind of constitute whether or not a tribe can be federally recognized. It's not so much a question that they're a group of Native American people. It's more so, did they already have an established relationship with the United States government? And a lot of times that is not well documented for various tribes, or it is completely ignored. But that is just like one obstacle, or like the requirement of having treaties with the government. There are often times that the government decided not to create official treaties with the tribes and ultimately just attempted to decimate them. And some modern issues, one of the biggest is funding. That's a really big one for the Lumbee Tribe. We are the 9th largest in the nation, with around 60,000 members. And for the government, that's a huge financial situation, just because there are so many members. It would take a lot of money to support us as a federally recognized tribe. And although that doesn't necessarily apply to all tribes, I feel like that is a factor in pretty much most tribes seeking federal recognition. And then a lot of it is just political differences, whether it be among tribes or just between the tribe and the government specifically. But there are definitely a multitude of obstacles.
And I thought, just in me trying to be prepared for today, that I saw somewhere that the Lumbee Tribe, there was a bill going before Congress, like that was the more difficult version, it sounds like, actually getting legislation passed for that, which I don't know where that stands, but that's a lengthy process. That's unfortunate. We have a follow-up from Margaret on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. You mentioned that the ACP was canceled because of cost. Do you think the protests by Native communities and others might have had something to do with the way Dominion Energy and their partners calculated cost, or if cost might have been a justification for cancellation in the face of the protests, as well as state government pushing back against it?
So yeah, I think it's a lot of both. The protests did ultimately halt a lot of the progress, just because there were a lot of environmental groups that were working with us, and they were finding ways that the pipeline would be environmentally unsafe, and we would bring those issues up, and that's when the government would say, okay, we have to get a permit to do this, or we have to reevaluate this to see if this would be environmentally safe. And ultimately the continued halts for the pipeline just caused the cost to continuously increase. I can't remember the exact number, but the amount of money that that it would cost them was significantly over their originally proposed budget. But I do also think that cost might have been a justification as to why they canceled it now instead of before. And I do think that that had a lot to do with the protest, just in general. And like I said earlier, I do see that there's a lot of intersection between just all Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. Yeah, so I do think that just the push from Black Lives Matter kind of prompted the company to say, we kind of want to abandon this project. And like I said, it wasn't just a project that impacted Native communities, it did impact BIPOC communities as well. So I do think that given that the protest for social justice did have a play in the cancellation of this pipeline.
And so kind of going in a different direction, I am very curious, and I don't mean to get political here, but I think has come up in some readings and in just the news that the Trump administration has not been the most, I don't know the correct wording here, but I guess supportive of Indigenous communities and endeavors like this. Do you have any thoughts, I guess, on the way that the current administration has treated Indigenous communities, or I know this is a very open-ended question. It almost asks for your political affiliation here, but I was just curious, in the current time that we're in this crazy 2020 year, this apocalypse that is 2020, if you had any thoughts on the current administration.
So yeah, this is a very politically loaded question, but I also think the answer is very political. I think that the way that the Trump administration interacts with Indigenous communities is purely political and is not based on any morals. I know for my tribe specifically, we are a location that we swing very often, so we could very well vote Democratic or Republican. And Trump's administration has put a lot of focus on the Lumbee Tribe as far as trying to vote Republicans into higher powers in North Carolina, just because we have so many members and we are such a political influence. So I feel like Trump with the Lumbee Tribe has expressed interest in us, but it is purely for political gain. Like for example, like during his inauguration parade, the Lumbee Tribe had representatives, and we were one of 2 tribes to march in that parade. He was in Fayetteville, which is 30-40 minutes outside of my community last week, speaking. His son, Donald Trump Jr., is in Robeson County a decent bit. And the push is more so for getting Republican members in office in North Carolina. But when it comes to other tribes and the actual things that tribes are pushing for, I have not seen any support from the Trump administration. In the push against the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and various pipelines across the country, Trump was very much in support of those pipelines. And I have not seen a lot of support as far as just supporting tribes and their needs. I have only seen interference with the Trump administration for political gain for the Republican Party.
Thank you for your candor on that one. I know what is the rules. You don't bring up politics, taxes, politics. I don't know your finances. So thank you for answering that. We have a question from Ryan. Do you see any risks or hazards to tribal communities who collaborate with big environmental groups on resistance to pipelines? Do you see any political risks or other social risks, especially for tribes seeking recognition?
Yeah, so I feel like this will be a very personal answer based on my experiences and what I've seen. and once again, I can't speak for all tribal communities, but I do see I do see that there could be some risk with tribal communities collaborating with big environmental groups, because I do see that when natives kind of collaborate with bigger groups, our voices are often overlooked and kind of pushed back, and it becomes more so of just an environmental issue. Um, and not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of times just native voices are completely left out, and that we are spoken over. I can't necessarily talk in relation to pipelines specifically. That's more of a general statement. But I do see a lot of political risk and social risk and resistance to certain environmental injustices, especially for tribes seeking recognition. I know for my tribe specifically, there were members in power who very much supported this pipeline, not because they thought that it would be beneficial, but because they thought that it could get us some sort of political gain, and that is likely the case. Had we supported the pipeline fully, there would have likely been political gain for my tribe, and it could have possibly helped recognition just because that is what the administration wanted. And then it could have possibly brought economic growth, but what the tribe was not necessarily considering is that it would ultimately harm our communities and would benefit those in power, not us specifically. But I do think there was a risk in tribal members protesting this pipeline, and there was a lot of pushback from various people in various parts of the state, nation, as we fought against this pipeline. And I don't know how that could impact our recognition, but I do think it was very much a risk, kind of pushing against the Trump administration and just these big corporations that have a lot of power and influence, because all it takes is one person in power to say, oh, why give this tribe recognition when they're not going to fight for things that would, what we believe would benefit the state.
That sounds like a really interesting, disappointing dichotomy. I think that exists in capitalist systems altogether. Kind of the economic gain, the political gain you can get from supporting these sorts of large projects versus the environmental justice concerns. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. So we have like 6 minutes left, and I wanted to dive a bit into you, Darien, because you're so amazing. Can you talk a little bit about yourself and your work, and how you've kind of, you're obviously this amazing advocate for Indigenous communities, for the Lumbee Tribe, but also kind of balancing your studies here at Duke. And kind of on top of that, it's my understanding that the Indigenous community at Duke there's not that much representation. And just curious how your experience has been at Duke as an Indigenous person. Yeah, that's what I got.
So yeah, when I got to Duke, it was a absolute complete culture shock. I grew up in Robeson County, which is a predominantly Native community. I grew up in my tribe, so that's kind of the only culture I ever knew. I never really traveled outside of the county or even the state, so I didn't really know how just society in general looked at Native people. So when I got to Duke, I got a lot of very ignorant questions about, oh, I didn't know Natives were educated, and just very stereotypical questions that you wouldn't think people would genuinely believe. But I did get a lot of those questions. So it was a huge culture shock for me. And there was a Native community on campus who I became involved in actually before I came to Duke. They actually paid for me to go to Duke before I accepted or before I committed to Duke, and that was one of the main reasons I actually decided to fully commit to Duke University, is just because of how supportive the Native community was, despite the fact that the community was not very well represented on campus. And after a few people graduated, that community kind of disintegrated. But I took the position of president for the Native American Student Alliance a couple years ago. And in that time, we have really strengthened the community, and our members have gotten a lot of support from administration. And a lot of this started with an article written by Shandine Herrera that talked about the lack of equality for Native students at Duke University specifically, and pretty much demanded that Duke do more for Native students. And I think that sparked a lot of social justice advocacy on campus specifically. And in that time, we have officially gotten a space on campus that reflects the just Native culture and kind of says that we are still here. And up until that, we were the only minority group on campus without a cultural space. Additionally, there are little to no Native faculty, and from my understanding, there is no one working as a professor who is Native. And we have gotten to create a committee that will do a cluster hire for Native faculty, which is huge for us. And from there, we are going to build an Indigenous Studies program as well as a Native American Center. And the last big goal that we're currently working on is we have a land acknowledgement committee that was started by myself, a couple other Native students, and someone in the Human Rights Center. Her name is Emily Stewart. And we have been working on doing an official land acknowledgement and getting Duke to adopt that land acknowledgement. And ultimately from there, we're going to consider possibly having Duke offer some sort of reparations for Native students, especially because Duke was previously a Cherokee boarding school. But aside from Duke's Native community, a little bit about myself and the work I do. So I am pre-med, so a lot of what I do research on aligns with Native American health disparities. So that's one way that I've been able to incorporate my culture into my studies without becoming overwhelmed. So a lot of my advocacy is on pushing for better healthcare for Native communities and lessening these disparities, whether it be in the realm of just genetic diseases, or if it's just stemming from a lack of governmental support or just a lack of cultural competency in healthcare in general. And in addition to that, I also do a lot of research on environmental injustice for Native people, particularly here in North Carolina, and my tribe specifically. And that's just kind of the extent of my research and how that aligns with my studies. And then outside of that, it's just general advocacy for Native Americans in all aspects, all fields of study, that sort of thing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I just know, I love the combination of environmental justice and pre-med there. It becomes all the more important as environmental injustices impact people's health in some of these communities. So major kudos, you're awesome. I think I've said that 20 times now, but it is 8 o'clock. Thank you all so much for joining us. If people want to give another silent round of applause / snaps for Darien, then feel free to do so. I'm going to do it here. And we will be sending out information, Darien's information on the Native American Student Alliance, as well as some of the links and Darien's video after today's session. So please be on the lookout there. You can find the recording of this on YouTube. We'll share that out in our email as well. And I guess everyone just have a great evening.
All right, thank you, everyone.